Hello, and welcome to Epochs. This is part two of my deep dive into the life and career and achievements of Leonardo da Vinci. So last time we left off just about when the French had deposed the leader of Milan, the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, where Leonardo loses his job at that point, essentially. He could have easily just gone into the employ of the King of France, which he did do right at the end of his life, so he wasn't necessarily against it completely. But at this point in his life, he decided not to do that. So he leaves Milan, where he'd lived for 17 odd years, decides to go to Venice. And if you remember last time, I've been reading quite a lot from the lives of the most excellent artists by Vasari, and I shall keep doing so because you guys kindly in the comments said, or the consensus was, that you didn't mind quite a lot of reading from Vasari. It is a great account. And so last time I left off, I believe, I was talking about Leonardo's work on the human anatomy and actually doing post-mortems on bodies, autopsies on dead people. Both a very old man, who he did an autopsy on immediately after he died, and also on a child, so he could compare sort of a young, healthy heart and organs with an old, broken set of organs. Very messy stuff, probably done by candlelight. Would have been very smelly, if nothing else. But to move on from that, because there's only about 20 odd years left in Leonardo's life. He died in his late 60s. But those 20 years are filled with things. Leonardo never sort of gave up and took his foot off the gas, so to speak. Well, he did right in the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years of his life. But still, the last 20 odd years of his life, he continued. In his notebooks, which we talked all about last time, he said repeatedly things like, you must persevere, which is a great life lesson. Despite any and all obstacles, you must persevere, because what else is there, you know? But he is starting to get old, you know, he's 50 odd by the time he's sort of forced out of Milan. And, you know, 50 is no spring chicken nowadays, but in the early 16th century, it just turned to the year 1500, 1501 sort of time by this point. 50 is kind of old, really quite old by that point. And he does talk about, you know, time does catch up to him a bit. He talks about being caught in the teeth of old age, the relentless march of the years taking their toll. It does even seem to be a little bit depressed, even. It seems like he may have suffered from a touch of depression here and there throughout his life. Most of us do at some point. Not everyone's life is perfect all the way through. So even a genius of geniuses had his self-doubts and his dark thoughts, dark moments. Now, it's kind of impossible to diagnose any real physical, let alone psychological problems after hundreds and hundreds of years. Still, it does seem to shine through that he had a touch of depression, despite saying things like, you must persevere and I'll never give up. You should never give up. Any man, any human, it's your duty not to give up. Always to keep striving forward, sort of regardless of any adversity. But he did say that old age was like a slow death. That's one of the things he said. The slow death of old age, and that it's humiliating in all sorts of ways. Still, there we go. I'll let Vasari sort of pick up the story a bit. He says, quote, to return to Leonardo's works, when during his lifetime the King of France came to Milan, Leonardo was asked to devise some unusual entertainment, and so he constructed a lion which, after walking a few steps, opened its breast to reveal a cluster of lilies. No more explanation is given. It seems like some sort of automaton, some sort of moving machine thing. They loved that in the Renaissance, or in the late medieval period. That was a great thing that very, very rich people would commission, some sort of moving automaton thing, and it seems Leonardo, at least just before he left Milan, constructed some kind of lion thing where lilies came out of its chest. Vasari goes on, it was in Milan that Leonardo took for his servant a Milanese called Cesare, a very attractive youth of unusual grace and looks, with very beautiful hair, which he wore curled in ringlets, and which delighted his master. Leonardo taught Cesare a great deal about painting, and some of the works in Milan which are attributed to him were retouched by Leonardo. So another quick word to say about Leonardo and his relationships. This Cesare, this child, he took under his wing and never left Leonardo until Leonardo died of old age in his late 60s. Now, it seems, I mentioned last time that Leonardo may or may not have been gay. He was accused of sodomy in his 20s in Florence and acquitted of that. And he certainly never got married or had children of his own. It seems he never really had any intimate relationships. It seems like he's probably some sort of volcel, a voluntary celibate. But he certainly had a couple of young men or boys that he took under his wing. Again, no suggestion of any sexual relationship. And Salai is one of those. And in his notebooks, Salai is mentioned more than anyone else. And it's actually a funny sort of relationship they had, because this Salai had some gift for drawing and painting, but was also really naughty. Like a bit of a tearaway. Leonardo complains about him all the time, although never dismissed him from his service. Apparently that never crossed Leonardo's mind. But he did complain about him, that he was really naughty. He called him like a little devil or something. And Salai stole money from him occasionally, small amounts of money, like stealing £10 out of your mum's purse or something. It's not vast amounts of money or anything, but stole from him. That's bad. That's pretty bad in my book anyway. You just don't do that. And just sort of got in trouble a bit and was a bit of a headache for Leonardo. But it seemed Leonardo loved him, at least platonically. And so, this Salai was by his side from that day on and until his death, followed him wherever Leonardo went. Because as I say, after he left Milan, the last 20-odd years of Leonardo's life, he roams around. He stays in Venice for a while, stays in Florence for a while, stays in Rome for a while, goes to France, but essentially never settles down anywhere and lives out the last couple of decades of his life in one place. And wherever he went, this Salai went with him and seems to have been really important to Leonardo. It's one of those things when you're a genius or a great person in some way, often, certainly in the Middle Ages, you want one particular protege. And this Salai, as I say, was a fairly decent drawer or painter in his own right, but never anything even remotely considered, genius level or anything. But there you go. Vasari goes on, quote, "Then Leonardo went back to Florence, where he found that the Servite friars had commissioned Filippino, a painter, a Florentine painter of the time, to paint the altarpiece for the high altar of the Annunziata. Leonardo remarked that he would gladly have undertaken the work himself, and when he heard this, like the good-hearted person he was, Filippino decided to withdraw. Then the friars, to secure Leonardo's services, took him into their house and met all his expenses and those of his household. He kept them waiting a long time without even starting anything. And then finally he did a cartoon showing, again, cartoon just means a painting, doesn't mean cartoon in our modern sense. And then he did a cartoon showing Our Lady with St. Anne and the infant child. St. Anne, at least in Apocrypha, it was supposed to be Mary's mother, so Jesus' maternal grandmother, St. Anne. This work not only won the astonished admiration of all the artists, but when finished, for 2 days it attracted to the room where it was exhibited a crowd of men and women, young and old, who flocked there as if they were attending a great festival to gaze in amazement at the marvels he had created. For in the face of Our Lady are seen all the simplicity and loveliness and grace that that can be conferred on the Mother of Christ, since Leonardo wanted to show the humility and the modesty appropriate to an image of the Virgin, who is overflowing with joy at seeing the beauty of her Son. She is holding him tenderly on her lap, and she lets her pure gaze fall on St. John, who is depicted as a little boy playing with a lamb. And this is not without a smile from St. Anne, who is supremely joyful as she contemplates the divinity of her earthly progeny. These ideas were truly worthy of Leonardo's intellect and genius. As I shall describe, this cartoon was subsequently taken to France. A fair few of Leonardo's works was subsequently taken to France, many of which with Leonardo's blessing during his life, but not all. Vasari says, Leonardo also did a portrait of Ginevra, the wife of Amerigo Benchi, a very beautiful painting. He abandoned the work he was doing for the friars, and they went back to Filippino, who, however, died before he could finish it. Now, as I mentioned in part 1, Vasari was paid by the Medici family to write essentially a hagiography of Leonardo, or all the great artists that the Medici had commissioned over the years, over the centuries. So Vasari does leave out anything that sort of isn't great about Leonardo, or might cast any kind of shadow, or might be politically sensitive really in almost any way about the life of Leonardo. He just leaves out. So there is one sort of big portion of Leonardo's life which Vasari doesn't mention, but I will. I don't owe the Medici family anything. So after he leaves Milan, he goes to Venice for a while and offers his genius to Venice. It's at that point in his life that he actually does the drawings or comes up with the concept of a diving helmet or a diving bell, because if anyone would want such a thing, it would be the Venetians. But they don't. It's one of the few times, or perhaps the only time really, in Leonardo's life where his powers of persuasion, his ability to play the game politic, don't really work. The Venetians don't trust him. The Venetians see him as some sort of Florentine / Milanese spy, perhaps. We don't know exactly their thinking, but they think of him as untrustworthy. And so they basically, after a while, turn down his offers for sort of, a permanent place in Venice. Anyway, there's a portion of his life after that, just around then, just at the turn of the 16th century, where Leonardo gets employed by Cesare Borgia. Now, a few words about Cesare Borgia, or the Borgia family. At this point, the Pope, Rodrigo Borgia, is the leader of the Borgia family, who are actually originally from Spain, is Pope Alexander VI. So he's the Pope. It's Rodrigo Borgia. Now, some popes in the early Middle Ages or in the Renaissance, some in the 13th century, but many in the 15th and 16th century, weren't particularly pious as we might know. Of course they were pious, massively pious, but they would act sometimes like any other Italian warlord. They would have sort of temporal designs on power in this world, put it that way. And perhaps the high watermark for that sort of thing are some of the Medici popes and the Borgia popes, or Rodrigo Borgia. He acted very much as a type of warlord rather than just a spiritual father. Let's say that. And I mean, he had a mistress and a wife, for example. Popes are not supposed to have any sort of partner. You're supposed to be married to the church. And yet he did, like openly. He had children. Pope shouldn't really have children. You're supposed to be ordained early in life and not really ever have had children. But he had children. He had children. And he used his children as any other sort of king or Italian duke would have done. Married his daughter off for political gain. Used his sons as captains His eldest son, he made sort of head of the papal armies. The papacy had an army. They're quite powerful. And he made his second son, Cesare Borgia, a cardinal in the first instance. Now, Cesare Borgia, people are split whether he was sort of a great ruler, a great military commander, or whether he was sort of some sort of demon incarnate. He was one of the, some say, he was one of the cruelest leaders medieval Italy ever saw. He was certainly ruthless. Many have said that Machiavelli's treatise on realpolitik, The Prince, is sort of modelled very much on Cesare Borgia, i.e. just do what is expedient, like realpolitik. Don't worry about God, don't worry about honour, just do what is ever in your best interest. I'm simplifying that massively. We do have a piece of content where Carl and I talk all about The Prince in detail. So look back for that if you want to know about the Machiavelli and The Prince in detail. But it seems that Cesare Borgia was the inspiration, at least on some level. Someone who was politically ruthless, let's say that. Politically ruthless. Politically fearless. Pulling the trigger on almost anything. Just whatever seems to be the best thing to do, even if it's massively risky, do it. So, for example, some examples of the ruthlessness of Cesare Borgia is that perhaps he killed his own elder brother. We don't know for sure, but being the second son, he was groomed for the church and wasn't expected to be the leader of armies and become a duke and have full-blown power in his own right. That went to his elder brother. So one day after his brother had had dinner with Borgia, he turned up dead, stabbed like 9 times and his throat cut and chucked in the Tiber after having dinner with Cesare. And all Cesare wanted was his elder brother out of the way, essentially. Yet there's no direct evidence Cesare had him murdered or murdered him himself, but, circumstantial evidence suggests he did. Other times he may have slept with his sister. It seems like he was in love with his sister. He certainly murdered, almost certainly, or pretty much did, murder one or even 2 of his sister's lovers or husbands. At one point his sister was married to, was it the cousin or the nephew of the King of Navarre, and he had him murdered. He tried to have him assassinated, and when that sort of failed and the guy was in hospital essentially, sent men round to murder him in his hospital bed. I mean, it's real sort of mafia stuff. And so he was ruthless, absolutely ruthless. A killer, full-blown killer, no doubt about that. I've heard him described, I think Gibbon describes him as the scourge of central Italy. He went around central and northern Italy with armies, papal armies, carving out power for himself. Now, a real warlord. And it's someone that you wouldn't necessarily think would be a good bedfellow for Leonardo. It's not that Leonardo would never have any truck with warlords. Of course he did. He worked for Ludovico Sforza for many a years, a type of warlord. But you would have thought that maybe Cesare Borgia would be a bit beyond the pale for Leonardo, but it seems not, at least not to begin with. So the accounts, not in Vasari, but other accounts do say that Leonardo and Cesare Borgia sort of personally got on. Oh, just to mention, after his brother had died, Cesare is allowed to not be a cardinal anymore. He had to get all the other cardinals and the Pope to sort of vote on that. It was almost unheard of. I think it might have been entirely unheard of for a cardinal to try and resign his position as a cardinal, but because his father, Rodrigo, was the Pope, they were able to pull on enough strings just about to make that happen. So he became a duke of more than one place and became leader of the papal armies. Now, it seems that he and Leonardo did personally get on. Although Cesare Borgia was extremely ruthless and a killer, he wasn't completely insane. You know, it wasn't like a Genghis Khan or maybe a Stalin where you fear for your life if you're in his presence, or Caligula, where you sort of don't do anything wrong and he'll order you murdered while you're sitting there having dinner. He wasn't that bad. And so, like nearly everyone else, it seems that Cesare Borgia liked Leonardo, loved him, was in awe of his genius, and just wanted to be his friend, wanted to pick his mind. So anyway, they worked together for a while, and one of Leonardo's things, as I said, was sort of designing and building various types of war machine. Now that would have been right up Cesare Borgia's alley. That's exactly the sort of thing he wanted. So for a few years, they went around together until eventually Cesare Borgia did something Leonardo sort of couldn't stomach. At one point, he, for political reasons, Cesare orders the three captains, his own captains, to be arrested and executed, sort of fairly brutally, just cut down, just say arrested. He just sent men to where they were and tell them that you're being executed now, and then just they are executed on the spot, effectively. And one of those three guys was a close friend of Leonardo. Now that was a bit too close to home for Leonardo. He sort of balked at that. He was sort of disgusted and outraged at that. It's often the way, isn't it, that until horror shows its face at your doorstep, until you see blood and gore and horror with your own eyes, it touches someone very close to you, someone you know and love, only then do you realise, oh, you know, what I'm mixed up in. That seems to what happened with Leonardo. So that was too much. That was a line in the sand for Leonardo.